Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Purdue. Welcome to West Lafayette for those of you who are coming from elsewhere. And we're going to have a couple of really interesting days of talk. So there's a sort of a theme every year we have when we invite people to keynote talks. And it's in the vein of what influences, what shapes the industry of cybersecurity. And really there are four groups, four classes of individuals who can be looked at as having some profound effect on the field. Obviously, the criminals and the ne'er-do-wells are one of those. We try not to invite them to give talks. However, if we find out that there's an active warrant on someone who needs to become, then we would be then. But other than that, the other three kinds of areas where like people and do field. Academics obviously very important. So we have people like Professor Hugh, and I'll take a moment here to mention we just announced that he is the recipient of this year's Ardent Fellows of Year's Work, which is the university's final award for achievement in research and engineering. So congratulations. So those of us in academia who spend a lot of time working with students and doing research over the years have had an impact on the field. Second area, those who work in government. And currently in today's climate, some people who work in government service get a bad reputation or a bad rap, and they shouldn't, because many of them could do much more interesting and more lucrative work elsewhere, but they devote themselves to public service. A recent example of someone like that, again, needs to CSAC, DHS. And there are others. We have one or two here today. And thank them for what they've done. The third area, and often has speakers, is the industry. And those of us in academia aren't always aware of some of the advances and the things that are done in the industry, but they're really at the front lines. We are really fortunate this year. We actually have two information security personnel from industry and one from a nonprofit who are all here to talk to us for keynotes. Our first, Venables, they've been in business for a long time. You can see his bio online if you visit the agenda page on the web. I'm not going to go through that because he's heard it many times, so you can hear it again. But he's had a career that has spanned multiple industries. Most recently, as Chief Information Security Officer at Google Cloud. This is a very intense position, considering the worldwide position of Google and many different parties who wish to penetrate the security of Google. He's transitioning into a role now as a senior advisor at Google, as he does other things. We don't think he would say he solved the problems at Google, but there's a limited amount of time that anybody can be on the firing line and be comfortable with that. But in that process, there and Goldman Sachs prior to that, and some of his other positions, he has gained a tremendous amount of insight experience. We've shared that with us today. His talk is from arsenal to industrial, building security scale for business and technology facility. And let's thank Venables for being here today.
When you receive the debate on the prize, that we actually do know how to secure So if you take a relatively straightforward computer system that delivers some useful business purpose, a relatively straightforward system, then you would find enough security experts to add to harden the operating system, firmware, encrypted, harden the OS, patch it, keep it up to date. ensure that these privileges by strong authentication, have like fantastic detection of response, to be constantly updating the machine. You know, if you apply enough experts or security architects to that system, you, for all practical purposes, even against advanced attackers, you can keep that secure. Now, the problem is, as we all know, no real world situation is actually like that. Even in small organizations, you don't just get one simple system, you get multiple systems. But the problem is, you don't just get kind of an order N effect, is you don't have organizations that are full of like aggregates of simple systems. The problem is, as we all know, there's intricate interdependencies between all of these different systems. And so you actually get something that's more like kind of, you know, order 2 to the n complexity with everything wired together. And the challenge is that we have in all of our security programs is, despite knowing what to do, it's actually really hard to do this at scale. So I'll give you one example before I start going through things. So about 15 years ago now, it's one thing, it's just one example that sticks in my mind that just happens all the time. I was working in a large bank, and we had a particular directory server from a company from up in Seattle, I won't name. I think I don't have to deal with these particular directory servers anymore. But we had this directory server that we needed to do upgrade the cryptography. I think at the time it was going from triple DES to AES. And you know, kudos to this one particular software company. You could go into the console and just flick this switch, upgrade crypto. You know, everything would be great. The problem is, in doing that, it required us to upgrade large parts of a whole series of different Unix network file system products that were dependent on a particular authentication protocol that had some behavior change as a result of that change in crypto. So you go, okay, let's go upgrade all of these kind of Samba servers and these NFS servers and do all of that kind of stuff. Great. Turns out we couldn't do that because we had a whole bunch of homegrown middleware and database infrastructure that depended on that particular sets of NFS products. And so to do that, you have to go upgrade this middleware and upgrade these databases. So, okay, let's go upgrade all of that stuff. Then it turns out some of our wonderful engineers, in the spirit of optimization, have built in some undocumented dependencies on some undocumented features on some of these database systems that, when you upgraded them, no longer had that property. So right, then we have to go upgrade all of that particular software and rewrite some of that code and find some of those engineers that were like working on something else 10 years later to come back and do that change. So lo and behold, 2 years later, you know, I finally got to flick that switch after nearly touching everything in the environment. Now, of course, the joke would be, in that 2-year period, if there had been like a data breach and there had been some investigation and they'd have found out we were running on old crypto, you know, you can imagine the headlines. These guys were like so stupid, they were running on old crypto without knowing. For 2 years, we've nearly been killing ourselves to kind of get everything upgraded. Now, this is just like one example. I could spend like 3 days talking about a myriad of other examples that we continuously see. We continuously see in lots of organizations. And in fact, again, when you look at many different types of incidents or breaches or other things, you can often trace it back to the organization actually knowing what they needed to do and try to do it, but not able to do it because of these dependencies and these issues of running security at scale. So as I kind of think about this, the reason for kind of delivering this talk is to just think about the differences between kind of artisanal and industrial approaches. These mainly the secrets to success of big enterprise scale security programs. How do you move from this artisanal, these kind of individual experts that we absolutely still need, but moving from these individual experts, they scale that at an enterprise scale because there's never enough people you're going to be able to hire to take an artisanal approach on even a medium-sized organization, never mind a large or a global scale organization. So when you look at kind of artisanal approaches, they're in any walk of life, they're typically individual and bespoke, they're hard to replicate, and they need constant attention. So, you know, I guess I don't know how familiar this analogy is. I don't know if it's being, I noticed that, you know, there's a few old people in the room like me. Do you remember there was an old stage act where people would spin plates? There was those plates on poles and a person would run up and down spinning the plates. A lot of security is like that, is you can keep all the plates doing, but if that person takes a day off or stops paying attention, very quickly plates start hitting the ground. And that's kind of artisanal approaches. It requires constant attention. And so what you really need to do is move to this industrialized approach. Now, again, when I use the analogy industrial, I want you to think of high-tech manufacturing plants, processor plants, high-tech, high-end pharmaceutical manufacturing, not 19th century steel mills or coal mines, although some organizations you go in and it does look like 19th century steel mills in their technology. But think about kind of high-tech manufacturing. And when you think about what needs to happen as a result of this is you drive that industrialization approach, and it's going to be really about how you create scalable, highly reliable, resilient, and efficient security programs. And ultimately, again, this is not about diminishing the skills of individual experts and making everybody a cog in the machine. It's about amplifying those artisanal experts to create that scalable program. Now, in most things, well, like most things in life, you can't just wish it were true. You can't just turn up one day and say, hey, I'm now going to decree I've got an industrial scale enterprise security program. You actually have to go through some things to make that happen. And over many years, I've observed there's probably four things, there's maybe a few others, but four main things you have to do to create an industrial scale security program that can protect large, complex enterprises. The first one, and I'll go through each of these in more detail in the subsequent slides, but just in summary, the first one is around metrics. You've clearly got to be able to measure your performance at scale. But the most important thing here is to go from lagging indicators to leading indicators. Now, give again an example. So lagging indicators would be things like security breaches, malware events, vulnerabilities. Those are kind of the outputs of an environment. And really what you need is more leading indicators. If you get those things right, you can't help but have achieved the lagging indicators. So I'll give you an example. So again, high-tech manufacturing, you look, and I don't know if you're going to this in the room, but high-tech manufacturing, you see a production line. Now, clearly they monitor the quality of what comes off the end of the production line, absolutely vital. So most of their measurement and metrics programs are about other things. Measuring whether you've designed manufacturability, it's measuring the quality of the input materials, it's measuring how well the machinery has been maintained, the preventative maintenance, it's measuring the collective skill and effectiveness of people on that production line to keep things running. It's a whole set of things. If you get right, you can't help but have the lagging indicators of quality of what happens as a result, then it has some effect. Now, I'll give some examples on the next slide. Secondly, you've also got to think about these so-called megatrends. So again, some of you may be familiar with this. A megatrend is just the general societal changes that happen, whether it's in society or economics or technology. But these are things like kind of demographic changes, climate changes, technology shifts. I mean, we're going through one at the moment with AI. There's a whole set of these kind of megatrends that you can take advantage of, or worse, if you position yourself against them, if your assumption is everything's going to be fine, despite this massive change going on in society, you're going to get crushed by that. And so again, industrial scale security programs tap into these technology megatrends and these societal megatrends to amplify what they can do. And again, I'll talk about some examples of this. Third, this is probably the one that's the most obvious, that in industrializing and scaling, you need to automate. But there's different ways of doing automation that have different effects. And then finally, you just got to adopt those industrial practices. And I'm convinced there's a lot that security can learn from many other engineering disciplines and apply those lessons to scalable security programs. And it's important as well to think about, if you're adopting an industrial scale environment, you've got to have the culture to think about managing at scale. And again, and some of you may appreciate this, but sometimes organizations wish they had a culture. You get a culture by doing the actions that you want. And so culture comes from action as opposed to the other way around. And again, we'll talk about what that looks like. So first in terms of metrics, so again, the important thing is to move from lagging to leading indicators and to measure the things that will almost guarantee you get the right lagging outcomes. And it's important to think about what the characteristics of all of these different metrics. So again, I think in many cases, there's not enough research being done on what are the characteristics of the metrics that security teams need to have. There's often just this kind of notion of just, you know, the old cliche of counting what you can count versus counting what you can't. There's not enough thought that goes into this. And when I look at organizations that do really well on security at enterprise and global scale, because they've got really good at measuring the right things in the right ways. So let's go through some examples of what we mean by some of the characteristics. So first, again, this is an obvious one. Things should be precisely measurable, but you don't know how many organizations are still kind of almost estimating things of kind of, you know, high, medium, and low, red, amber, green. There's a lot of stuff going on like that, and things need to be precisely measurable. In most other engineering or risk management disciplines, things are characterized by being actually quite precisely measurable. And they're not perfectly measurable, but they're measurable with some error bound and they're quite precise. Second, things need to be blameless and non-monetary. So the blameless point is important here, because again, if you want people to adhere to metrics and achieve goals, you can't make the metric something that immediately results in blame and punishment. Otherwise, people are going to gain the measurement and you don't get any ground truth. I'll give you an example of this. I've kind of seen a lot of organizations that go through this path. Let's pick on a kind of a measurement of the ability of an organization to achieve software security goals. So you might measure one team and it has a software base where, let's say, they've got 99% coverage of their code base being subject to software security analysis. And then another team is at 20%. And so you think, just look at those metrics and you go, wow, you know, team at 99%, give them a gold medal. Team at 20%, fire them immediately, get them to go do something. The point of being blameless is you then need to look at what the context is of that. It might be the team at 99% got there a year ago because of some prior leadership, and they had a much simpler task than the other team. And while they're at 99%, they're on the cusp of it all being wrecked and it going down to kind of 0% because the current leadership are not paying attention. But without going behind the numbers, you don't really know that. And it might be the team on 20% has like inherited a whole set of problems a year ago that have radically re-engineered everything, and they've got a much bigger complex problem. And they're on the cusp of going from 20% to 100% and making that sustainably so because they've done it well. When you look behind that, the team at 20% needs the gold medal and the team at 99% needs the chastisement and correction. So again, it's important to look at metrics in a blameless way, not just to avoid the gaming of the measurement, but to actually get to the ground truth that incentivizes the right long-term behavior. Third, it needs to be purposeful. So the measurement needs to have some positive side effect in and of itself, not just because of the outcome you drive from them. So I'll give you an example of this, and this is a particularly kind of painful one for me, but also beneficial. So again, this is my experience from quite a while ago. So one of the things you need in most security measurement programs is you need an inventory of what's in your environment. You need to understand the universe, whether it's the hardware, the systems, the software, the data. You need to have an understanding of what's your inventory. Now, the great thing about inventory programs, and this is my experience, is an inventory program, you need to do all those measurements. But when you actually measure what's in your environment, you can uncover lots of inefficiencies. So again, when I first ran an inventory program 15 plus years ago in a particular organization, we conducted an inventory. It was an automated scanning of the entire infrastructure. I think it really served me well. We found about 4,000 servers, and these were back in the days when servers were quite expensive things. 4,000 machines. They were basically sat there doing nothing. I mean, they were quite well managed, but they were sat there consuming power and running stuff. But there was, other than the operating system, there was really nothing running them. Those kind of 4,000 machines, quite expensive, that we were able to either shut down and recoup the costs or redeploy into other things. We saved millions of dollars on just that. That more than paid for the inventory program itself. So this is a good example, and there's many other examples you can think of where the act of doing the measurement creates some transparency, that creates some incentive to do some other changes, not for the security reasons of measuring, that creates that kind of economic effect. So it delivers these adjacent benefits, which again, the reason for that is you then get more continuous support from all levels of the organization to do these things, because they're not just being done for security purposes, they're being done for many other business, commercial, or in the government sense, mission purposes. Is an interesting kind of side thing. One of the nice things is where I worked before in financial services, all the financial services chief security officers get together and kind of share their pain with each other about how to do these things at scale. I was telling this story about kind of inventory and finding these 4,000 servers, and a chief security officer from another bank I won't name just went, basically said to the group, like, well, that's nothing. We did the same inventory program, and we found a whole data center that was just basically sat there running nothing. It was like tens of thousands of servers. And basically what happened is they've acquired another company, and they've consolidated all of the infrastructure and the software into the acquiring company's data center. And just for whatever reason, the data center kind of management and consolidation program have not switched off this data center. It was just sat there and running quite happily. And this is the problem of like levels of abstraction. The people in that data center running that data center, they didn't have the visibility to realize there was nothing running on those servers. You know, they were all quite well maintained, operating systems kept up to date, all that kind of, they just weren't running any useful workload. And so whenever you go looking for these kind of inventory, you're always going to find these kind of issues. But the lesson applies is no matter what you measure, you can always find some other beneficial side effect of doing it that creates the impetus for you to keep doing it and deliver business, not just security. Fourth, they've got to be fractal. So in other words, the measurement has got to be consistent at multiple levels. So again, if you're measuring some degree of vulnerability, that measurement has got to make sense at a company level, at a product level, a team level, an individual. It's got to be reasonably self-consistent at different scales. And that's important, again, because organizations need to know that if they're changing things at a small scale, it'll have a consistent effect on the large scale. Many measurements don't operate like that, and they become problems in that way. So you can construct most measurements that be fractal. Fifth, and this may be another obvious one, is they've got to be standardized or standardizable in the sense that other people, when taking that measurement, should get the same results. This is particularly important if you're in an organization where security is constantly subject to external scrutiny from regulators or auditors or customers. You've got to make sure that your measurements stand scrutiny and are capable of being independently measured. And so you've got to publish the methodology, you've got to understand how the methodology works, you've got to show that it can be independently measured. It's got to be linear as well. So in other words, if good means up, then it should be proportionally up. If you measure it, it's proportionally up. That's actually quite difficult to do. And then finally, one of the things I like to call it kind of Pareto is kind of 80-20, is there is so many things you can measure at an enterprise scale security program. You can drown in measurements and spend so much effort measuring things that you don't actually get to spend time on fixing the things you measure. So it's important to find the 80-20. So what's the 20% of the measures that if you get right, affect 80% or more of your risk outcomes? Now, to give you some examples of all of these, here's some of the, on the right, some of the best metrics that I've seen that hit all these goals. And as I go through them, you'll realize that most of them are not actually security metrics. There are things that are necessary to then achieve the security goals you have. So the first one is software reproducibility. So what percentage of an organization's software is under central management in a central consolidated software repository? And is it capable of being reliably and reproducibly rebuilt, tested, and deployed? So what percentage is that? So for many organizations, that's actually quite low. A lot of organizations have quite low degrees of software consolidation that don't necessarily are able to reproduce and reliably rebuild and deploy. But large, complex, and global technology organizations like Google, for example, the percentage is very high. And there's organizations in between. And we all know why this is important for security. It lets you do changes. It lets you keep things up to date. It lets you analyze the software security more effectively because you've got a consolidated testing and build process. But again, in these adjacent benefits, it gives you massive commercial benefits. So even if you didn't care about security, you would still want to have software that improves reproducibility in the business. So you can keep the software up to date, you can be more responsive to customer needs, you can be more agile, you can do more changes, you can be more resilient. So all of those things deliver security as well as a side effect as some of these broader business goals. The fascinating thing about this one is interesting. So often I present to boards of big companies where we're helping them do their security program. And sometimes a board will say, you know, what's the one thing we have to do to make sure security is right? And they're always expecting me to say something like, buy one of our shiny security products or deploy this kind of security thing. I go, no, get your software reproducibility under control, get all your software in one place because you get all these benefits. And then sometimes the response is, well, isn't that like a bit in the weeds? Isn't that, you know, can you not just give us something a bit more abstract and high level? And to which my response is always, imagine if the chief financial officer came in front of you, the board, and you, the board, basically said, are all our finances under control? And, you know, can we reconcile our general ledger? And do we know all our cash flow? And do we know our cash positions around all our businesses? And is it all reconciled? And then the CFO went, well, I don't know. I've got a few spreadsheets here, and this one business unit does it like this, and over here it does that. And I guess we can understand what our cash position is in 6 months. You know, CFO probably by the end of the day. Yet today, if boards ask the CIO or the CTO that question, they kind of get a similar answer. Now, this is not a criticism of CIOs and CTOs. They've got a very hard job and are often grinding quite hard to bring all of this, you know, decades of legacy software under some semblance of central control. But this is why boards need to kind of ask more questions about, is the technology set up to be defensible and modern, as opposed to is it just secure? And they need to hold CIOs and CTOs and business executives just as much accountable for these things as the CISOs themselves, which is why some of these leading indicators versus lagging indicators are so important. I'll start going through some of the others a bit, more quickly now. But infrastructure reproducibility is the same one. Can you reliably rebuild your infrastructure on demand using, say, immutable infrastructure patterns or declarative configuration or configurations code, that type of work? Or do you have to, have your system administrator artisans turn up at a physical server and do some magic to bring that server up? Most organizations are not like that. Some organizations, sadly, are still like that. Another one that is one of my favorite measures is cold start recovery time. So this is how long does it take for an organization? Imagine they were completely wiped, through whatever event, destructive malware, ransomware, other types. They've basically got nothing left. They've just got blank cloud instances or bare metal machines. And hopefully they've got a set of immutable backups. How long does it take to reboot the company? And most organizations can't answer that question. There's a few reasons why they can't answer that question. Because backups and recovery are normally done from the perspective of an individual system failure or recovery, not a pervasive failure of the entire environment. Another one I like to do with a lot of organizations, and I've done this with a few quite large companies, is to again say to the board and the business and technology leadership, but can you reboot your company if everything's fine? And their answer is mostly, yeah, we're fine. My team tells me all our backups are great, they're regularly tested. And I go, okay, do me a favor, just pick a business unit to do this test. And I've never found an example where they don't come back and go, oh God, it went horribly wrong, and we couldn't do it. And the reason they can't do it, again, is because backups are not designed to reboot your company. Backups are designed to bring back a particular failed system. And the reason sometimes backups don't work in these pervasive, large-scale events is there's a common set of things. So sometimes the backups themselves don't have the backup software on it. And so again, I've seen organizations where the first thing they have to do is call up the backup vendor and get some new software so they can actually put the software on the systems to then bring all the backups back. Sometimes the backups don't have the index to the backups. So you've got all the backups and you just don't even know what order to bring it all back. Sometimes, and I've seen this quite a bit, is circular dependencies. So again, when you're wiped, how do you bring everything back? Classic example, sometimes you might want to bring back a domain name system, which you need DNS to recover everything, but you can't bring that back unless you've got an authentication server up and running. The trouble is you can't restart your authentication server without DNS running. So again, when you think about rehydrating an environment, you've got to take different steps rather than just restore and backup. And the final reason as well sometimes is when an organization has been wiped, even if they're perfect at all these other things, it still takes months because they typically have one data pipe from the backup system to the rest of the environment. It's capacity constrained. So again, leading edge organizations, when they think about this cold start recovery time, they ask, what would it take for me to reboot my company in these events? They test all of these things. And their first number they come up with is like, oh God, it's like months to do this. And then they invest a bunch of money to get it down to weeks or days. In some cases, I've seen organizations get this down to kind of hours. And then there's a different level of investment needed for that time. And you can get metrics, set the dial of how quick you want to be. But again, the framing of that one question, what's my cold start recovery time, spawns all of that different activity about how you do this stuff. Another one is what we call OODA spread, so observe, orient, do, act. So this is typically how responsive are you as an organization? How fast is your OODA loop of thinking about new threats that gets to new defenses? Is that loop faster than your attackers? And so you can measure how quickly attackers respond, you can measure how you respond. If you're not faster than your attackers, then that's a kind of a doom spiral. Most organizations that do really well on this are constantly thinking about that response time loop of staying ahead of threats by consuming threat intelligence. Another one is system stagnancy and preventative maintenance. There's this kind of law out there that legacy systems are bad. The reason sometimes most organizations call things legacy systems is because they are legacy in a good way. There's many large Fortune 100 organizations. Some of their oldest systems have been around for decades, but they're literally the foundation of most of their businesses. And those systems can often actually be quite well maintained. So this implication that legacy is bad is not always correct. The real framing is what percentage of those systems are what you might call stagnant. In other words, they're not kept up to date, not maintained. That's the problem. And so a lot of organizations, when they measure system stagnancy, they realize they've got 10, 20, 30, maybe even higher percentage of systems that have not had any degree of maintenance for many years. That's the problem. And then again, leading organizations institute some forced metrics around what percentage of their IT budget is spent on preventative maintenance. So the 5 to 10% of the budget each year is spent keeping things up to date, keeping software up to date, keeping systems up to date. Again, analogous, as I said before, to the industrial environment, where you would never think of running a high-tech production line without a fixed percentage of the environment being spent on preventative maintenance, because that's the only way you're going to avoid everything breaking down. So adopting that mindset, again, most leading companies that do really good security programs have preventative, they may not call them preventative maintenance, but they effectively have preventative maintenance projects that forcefully allocate resources to keep things up to date, keep things defended, keep controls up to date, keep things monitored. And that's a core part of what they do. And then finally, another great leading indicator is what we call control pressure index, which is understanding your defense in depth. So again, leading organizations, they all have complementary controls, defense in depth. It's important to understand when you look at that, just how much of each of those controls is bearing the load of all of the controls. When you actually look at that, sometimes you realize you spent all this money on 6 layers of defense, where it's actually one control bearing all the load, and if that fails, none of the other controls will actually help. Yeah, another example I remember in a prior life, I moved out of security and was in risk, in financial risk management for a while. One of the things I always remember doing, we did this analysis of a set of controls that we used to defend against certain unauthorized activities. This was more of a kind of a business process, unauthorized activity. And we used a Bayesian network modeling technique to basically construct this Bayesian network of all the different controls, how they were all dependent on each other, and overlaid a series of probability distributions of control failure based on measurement over many years. And then with a Bayesian network, you can then run a Monte Carlo simulation effectively to profile which are the controls that bear the most load. Turns out the one control in this network of about 15 controls that was bearing the load was a control intuitively we thought had no value. We were going to disable and rely on all the other controls. So again, the spirit of measurement to actually understand what's going on is really important. We do similar things in a lot of cyber controls and to really understand what is actually the load bearing control in a particular environment, as opposed to the ones that we intuitively think it might be. Let's actually do some real measurement back to that point and precisely measurement. Okay, I'm going to start going quicker now because the thing I wanted to really cover was leaving not lagging. So mega trends. Now I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to go through the side chart, but really what we think about here, as I mentioned before, is the most important thing to tap into is these trends in technology or trends in society that can kind of add impetus to what we're doing. So, some of the classic things I mentioned, kind of demographics. So also, when you look at technology over many years, if you weren't tapping into assuming the fact that hardware was going to get cheaper and cheaper because of Moore's law, you were probably positioned in the wrong way. If you built a business strategy 20 years ago and hardware was always going to be more expensive, if you were going to be fundamentally wrong and positioned in the wrong way. There are many other trends happening like that. So I'll pull out a few. And again, we'll have the slides available for reference. But the first one is particularly in cloud environments, the economy of scale. So, and then again, working at a cloud provider as well as a big tech company, I know I'm kind of selling my own game here, but I'm doing it because I believe it, is the reason why most organizations do and should use cloud is to tap into an economy of scale that they don't otherwise get in traditional on-premise technology environments. So, for example, at hyperscale cloud, the unit economics of security change quite significantly. So we can raise the baseline of control by reducing the cost of control because of the scale. So I'll give you a very specific example. So a few years ago, we built a security chip. And we've now actually open source the design of this, so you can actually go build your own hardware based on open fighting. But it's basically a hardware root of trust that provides a foundation of trust for doing a secure boot of this environment. So we designed this, it cost quite a lot of money, but we deployed it across millions upon millions of servers. So the amortized unit cost of that investment is just pennies when we deploy it in the infrastructure. Similarly, we encrypt everything everywhere, and it costs us almost nothing because we've pervasively built it into an infrastructure that's so large, the unit cost of doing that continuously goes down. Now, organizations that use this infrastructure, they're effectively getting secure boot, pervasive encryption, a whole set of other controls at minimal extra cost. In fact, they don't ever see the cost because you just flatten it into the whole cost of the environment. Now, in the on-premise environment, as environments are shrinking, their unit cost of doing that by definition goes up. So, hyperscale cloud is just basically a big controlled amortization engine that reduces the cost of control, which enables us to keep raising that baseline of control to a point you can't traditionally get in other environments. I'll give you another example. Again, this is another cloud example of cloud as a digital immune system. And this is something, so all of the cloud providers with each other and of ourselves, wire all of our defense and detection and response and threat intelligence sharing together. So, for example, I can see an attack on one environment. We may respond to an incident using our management incident response team, or we may find a vulnerability through our vulnerability research, and we can figure out how to defend against that and pervasively deploy that across a global scale infrastructure before attackers have a chance to get to that. Again, I'll give you an example. About 2 years ago, we found a particular vulnerability being exploited in one organization where we were helping with incident response. I won't name not one of our products, it was a third-party product that a customer was running on our infrastructure. We were able to identify that vulnerability and then basically fix that with some layered defenses across a global scale of infrastructure before the vendor of that software was able to patch it 90 days later. This was an example where we then were able to see hackers trying to go after that in multiple places, but the immune system had responded by defending that in multiple places before they could get to it. So again, that's an example of it usually being faster than the attackers usually. Again, wiring things together at scale makes it up. So again, these are just examples of a mega trend that if you position yourself in the right way, you can just get all of that for free at industrial scale. The one final thing I'll call out in there as well is this notion of simplicity. And anybody that's ever used a large-scale technology company or a large-scale technology environment or large-scale cloud environment, you don't immediately sit down at a cloud console and think, wow, this is so simple and intuitive. In fact, it still looks quite complex. But the problem is, if you look at traditional enterprise environments, nobody ever sees the full complexity of what goes on there. So again, if some of you may have experience with this, some of you may be sufficiently young, you've never had to experience this, paying good on you. Is you go back to kind of traditional large-scale environments. They've got systems administrators, network engineers, database administrators, software engineers, security engineers, systems engineers, and administrators. They've got these large collections of roles. In any reasonably sized system, no one person really ever has to deal with the whole complexity of it all, because the storage engineers are in their silo doing their thing, the database administrators are in their silo doing their thing. And so there's never any pressure to simplify this. When you stick it all in the cloud, typically the software engineers or the cloud engineers get to see all of that complexity in one place. So what do? They complain to us like crazy that, wow, this is so complex. And so there's this feedback loop then where we can put in the layers of abstraction to simplify things, to make sure it's more self-configured, self-managed, more security is kept up to date. And so the near exposure of putting these things together creates this kind of abstraction feedback loop that makes them simpler and simpler and has the raising of the baseline of security built into things. So again, I encourage you as you look at what you will do and what you may all do in the future is just think about in an environment I'm in, what are these mega trends, these forces that are shaping that environment? Now, of course, the big one is, we never documented it originally as part of thinking about these mega trends. We never put AI in there. That's largely because we thought it was just so pervasive in everything that we were doing, we didn't need to call it out. Having said that, though, one of the things we now think about this kind of AI as the ninth mega trend is because it is particularly generative AI is reshaping the way we do security. Now, I'm not going to make this a talk about AI, but one of the things I will say is the way we think about this at Google is really three pillars. There's how do we think about the threat actors using AI for nefarious purposes. At this stage, we don't see a lot of that. We see it used for kind of automating certain types of attacks, for generating better phishing emails, for constructing misinformation, disinformation, that kind of stuff. But we're not yet seeing it to create, for example, new types of malware or discover zero-day vulnerability. That's going to come, but it's not that sophisticated yet, attacking users. Now, I'm not happy about that because what that means is attackers are still having a field day with good old-fashioned attacks as opposed to having to use the new technology. I quite like it when attackers have to go to being more sophisticated because it means we're making life harder for them. That's not the case yet. The third one is how do we secure AI by default? So how do we ship security and trustworthiness and compliance and privacy in the tooling that lets organizations deploy AI safely? The thing in the middle that we're most focused on is how do we use AI to drive security, and we're having already dramatic effects in doing this, whether it's in our own vulnerability discovery, anomaly detection, automation, even the stacked benefits of lots of mundane changes to the workflow. So, for example, all of our security event and other write-ups that our teams used to have to do manually is now using one of our security large language models that turns out to write better event reports and lessons learned in post-mortem than the humans can do. And the humans prefer the AI doing that in the first place so they can do some more kind of, less toilsome jobs. So again, we're seeing a lot of power of AI to transform many of these things. And with rapid advancements in the synchronization of how AI agents will interact with systems is just going to propel that even further as a mega trend to add on to. Now, in terms of automation, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one of the things I will talk about in terms of automation is, it's obvious we need to automate lots of things at the industrial scale. The one thing I'll say is that is the importance of continuous control monitoring. Another thing is when you look at most breaches that happen in most organizations, it's not that they didn't think to have a control or controls that could have stopped that bad thing happening. It's the fact that the control they thought they had wasn't actually working or effective at the time they needed it. And so most kind of incident response post-mortem meetings that happen after breaches, you can just imagine it. Most of the time, the security person is reading through saying, yeah, the attacker got me this way and they did this. And then somebody in the room will put their hand up and go, hang on a minute, didn't we have a control that was supposed to stop that? And then there's some team will say, yeah, we did, but it got switched off 2 weeks ago because we did this upgrade and then we switched it back on. Or, yeah, we switched it off because it was causing a performance. The whole litany of reasons. And so it's really, really important. But again, leading high-scale organizations do this relentlessly, which is to understand what all of their controls are, where those controls should be deployed, and then relentlessly monitor the fact that those controls are in where they should be and are operating and are emitting data continuously to let you see that they're working effectively. Again, this is another one that's quite difficult, and I've done this over a few years, is going to organizations and teams and look at a particular control that is actually working quite effectively, but it's not emitting enough data to let you monitor the fact that it is continuously working, and then get those businesses that actually change that control that is otherwise working quite well, to change it to be something that can emit data so you can continuously monitor whether it's working or not. That's just a tough sell, but it's a necessary sell, because most of the time these breaches come from the control that was supposed to be there that got disabled through some of the reasons. One of the things as well, it's important, many of you may be familiar with the discipline of site reliability engineering, this kind of continuous engineering driven process to improve the reliability. One of the things that I like to think of this is you should have a control reliability program, which is, are you monitoring your controls for ongoing effectiveness? And are you, when you detect the failure of a control, you're treating that as a first-class priority event, whether or not it becomes a security incident. And that discipline of control reliability engineering is what drives this, forward. I remember many years ago we had a near miss at one company I worked at, and it was a network-driven intrusion, and our network intrusion detection sensors didn't pick it up. And when we actually went through the post-mortem, it turns out for about a week, the network intrusion detection sensors were reading 0. Nothing happening, no bad things happening. But in reality, that should never occur. There should always be something happening. In reality, there was a surrounding network change that isolated these network intrusion detection sensors. So after that, the thing we did is we generated, we created a system to generate synthetic events continuously, so that all sensors were always reading something, even if it was just the synthetic test events continuously. So we could always know that things were working. The reason we kind of thought of this is I got that long enough. I used to work in inside environments with nuclear reactors. And one of the things, if you've ever been inside a nuclear facility, there's no background radiation inside a nuclear facility because they're shielding. So the background radiation can't get in. So the radiation detectors inside these environments are always reading 0 unless something bad happens. So what they actually do is so they can distinguish between a radiation sensor genuinely reading 0 or being broken. They have little tiny radiation sources in radiation detectors, so they're always registering something. So when they do inspections, they know that the sensors are working. There's more modern ways of doing that there, but essentially that's the same example of how do you know your controls are working? And in an environment where it's 0 might mean broken or it might mean no attacks, you've got to generate some synthetic thing as you do this continuous control line. And that's another example. Again, when you think about industrial level, global scale organizations running security in such a complex environment, you have to engineer things differently because you can't rely on your architect spinning that plate to make sure everything is still working. So just starting to wrap up now. So again, we think about the industrial practices of what organizations need to do. Again, these are deliberate things that you have to introduce. So technology needs to shift from being kind of security bolted on to then default on to actually engineered in. We spend so much time, especially at Google, thinking about how do we build in security? So security is there by default rather than people having to buy a product or do something else to get on top of it to make it secure. And I think that is the future of many organizations. How do you make the secure path easy path? How do you build it rather than bolt it on? How do you measure how well you're doing it? Similarly, a lot of operations not only have to go from manual to automated, but ultimately become autonomic. And there's a subtle distinction there. Many times when you look at something, a manual process that's been automated, it's just the automation of a terrible process. And what you actually need to do is reimagine what it means for systems to be self-managing and self-defending. I'll give you an interesting example. This is back to the AI example. But when you think about constructing AI agents, there's a different philosophies out there in different companies. So some companies are building AI agents to automate people's jobs. What we've concluded after a lot of experimentations is what's actually better is to take an AI agent and use that to automate the use of a tool. And then have an AI agent orchestrate other tool using agents to construct a set of activities to achieve an outcome. It turns out when you let the AI to do that, it comes up with a radically different way of structuring the world than you typically used to structure for humans. So if you use an agent to automate a human's job in some way, you're going to constrain the AI to how you constrain the human job, which is often in response to actually human activity. Turns out if you devote AIs to agents to automate tool use, then you actually going to get a whole different construction. So again, it's specifically automated and autonomic. Similarly with talent, so we have to move from specialized to localized to what we call democratized, which is, we don't think that AI is going to diminish skills. We think AI ultimately is going to amplify people's skills. It's going to enable relatively junior and inexperienced people to operate at a higher level. It's going to enable experts to operate at different levels to scale of expertise. And ultimately, we're going to open up these types of roles of security to more and more of an organization at all levels, in all disciplines. And a big part of what we do is driving that tooling out there. Similarly, kind of sharing responsibility with customers ultimately means that you actually take a shared faith approach with customers, that you're more proactively managing security people who are running on these technical platforms. And then finally, making sure that as you deal with threat intelligence, it becomes less about the relationships of sharing intelligence with people and more about building the pipes and the infrastructure to feed intelligence in real time to drive that progressively faster yield state active. So just in closing, I think the best security for industrial scale global organizations is where security is built in, not bolted on. It's about having a defendable technology environment, not by having a technology environment very secure by dropping the security back. It's about making sure that the goal is business and technology agility with all of those leading indicators, which you get security as a side effect. And it's about driving a more kind of controlled, software-defined environment that you can get to this level of speed. And ultimately, that is why we're doing this, is just relentlessly deliver, because speed is our best defense. The more we can upgrade environments faster, keep environments dependable, responsive, threats quicker, we can impose radically different costs and attackers through the industrial scale practices that drive speed. With that, I will close. If there are questions now, or just go straight to the panel. We'll go straight to the panel. So, thank you.